Good morning and good afternoon to all of you. My name is Glenn Adamson, and I am your moderator for this last panel in the inaugural digital conference that's hosted by the Design Academy SALEC, or dieDAS. I'm really pleased that you were able to join us today. We are on the third day of a fantastic event. We've had some really terrific talks over the course of our proceedings, and also had a chance to meet the fellows who are currently in residence at dieDAS as the first group who are staying on site and pursuing their own creative experimental projects. We are rounding out our conference today with a panel with 3 speakers. We're going to be talking about the concept of growing buildings, a lovely phrase, and with the subtitle Material Ecologies in Architecture and Communities. The idea here being that we're going to now think about scaling up from the object to the building, to the built environment. And we're also going to be thinking hard about the way that organic processes that might involve actual biomimicry or in some other way imply some kind of natural, sustainable effects could transform the world around us, which obviously is something that we all need urgently to think about. So I'm going to be just playing the role of moderator over the next hour and a half. You'll hear from me again when question and answer comes around. And as the speakers talk, do put your own questions in the Q&A box. But apart from introductions, I'm going to now hand it over. So let me first tell you who you'll be hearing from. First, we have Christian Benimana, who is the Senior Principal and Managing Director at Mass Design Group in Kigali, in Rwanda. Hello, Christian. Good to have you with us, calling in from Kigali. Then we will hear from Anna Heringer, who is the Honorary Professor UNESCO Chair for Earthen Architecture, Building Cultures, and Sustainable Development. Anna, welcome. Good to see you. And finally, we have joining us from Harvard's Graduate School of Design, the Sarich Professor, and in fact, the Dean of the GSD. Sarah, it's a real honor to have you with us as well.
Thanks, Glenn.
Okay, so without any further ado, I'm going to ask Christian to go ahead and lead us through his presentation. So we just have quick presentations from each of our 3 panelists, and then we'll have a group discussion and then take your questions. Christian, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. Sharing my screen, please give me a thumb up to know if you can see the screen.
Yep, looks good.
Great. All right, so I assume you can hear me well. I'll try to go through, but before I start flipping slides, I want to at least explain the angle in which I'm approaching this topic from. Obviously covers a lot, but the best way that I can talk to it is through our projects, the work that we have done. And one of the things that was challenging to me was to try to explain the rationale, the need, and the importance, the urgency behind us thinking about these things more radically and sooner than we thought we were going to have to do that. And the best way that I could think about it begins from our philosophy, the mantra to which our practice is founded. We strongly believe that, you know, with every intervention we do through our project, we are either helping our society grow or we're doing something that keeps it back from growing as it should. And, you know, our work is not meaningless and it's not meant to be and should not be ever thought as such. So because of that, I wanted to utilize this particular goal that I think most of us are very familiar with. I hope there are no climate change deniers on this in this forum, but and if they are, we're happy to have a separate conversation and, you know, have a separate conference about it. But I think the reason why I started from it is because it's very simple. It outlines the problem. It kind of like put a cap to when we need to take action. It's very clear about what action we need to take. And I think it's a good goal to begin from and walk backwards now, understanding what it means for our profession and our practice and things we do. And more importantly, to the material choice that we're talking about here and the supply chains that contribute building this project, the decisions making we need to do to get this project done and built in a way that at least we can demonstrate that they're contributing or not contributing to fighting climate change. So that's the angle I'm going to approach it from, and I'm more than happy to expand when I get to Q&A. So if you think about it from our founding philosophy that I just mentioned, you could also, argue that architecture practice in general, we've been pretty good at hiding behind jargon and talk about things that, we kind of like pretend like mere mortals cannot understand. And I talk about sustainability and all the cool things that we create and do things. And I think if you want to distill down what our goal is to leave around like all these like unexplained things and now jump into things that are concrete and say, we want our architecture not to be sustainable simply, but let's make it climate positive, and then determine how we do that. Obviously, the first question that comes when we say, the statistics, the empirical data, what are we having if we say we need to have that our emissions by 2030 and be carbon positive by 2050? Let's start by the halving. So reducing our emissions to half, what it means is that the operation carbon needs to be halved. And then the embodied carbon, we'll talk about it later and spend a little bit more time on it, because the passive system, I think, has been in conversation for some time now. And I think many people are very well versed into, the interventions of things we need to do to achieve that. Passive systems, ventilating our buildings naturally and lighting them naturally as much as we can. But more importantly, what we need to change is to leave this to individual housing. Because what you find is that we have all these conversations and everything else, and you find that we load people because they've done it on their individual residences. But we need to challenge the status quo and force larger institutional projects that have the potential to set an example of how this could be done with the modern society, with the modern lives, and start from there. And then, of course, the individual housing units can bring this to scale, but the real fundamental change needs to come from institutional projects. So this is our attempt to try to figure out like policy that allows, let's say, the Rwanda Ministry of Health to structure their hospital buildings to start utilizing and relying more on passive systems. And hopefully other large institutional projects can begin imitating into this. I can speak later to this work, but basically like it builds on our work in Rwanda to build into policy some of these interventions we're talking about. And this is a project we right now building in Monrovia, Liberia, a climate that is unforgiving in terms of it's kind of like temperature and humidity. And yet we know very well that there are passive systems that exist that can help us also achieve these targets, even in harsh environments like that. So there's no excuse for us not to do that. So that's what I'm going to talk about passive at the moment, and we can come back to it later. And I'm going to focus more on the carbon footprint, embodied carbon footprint of our buildings. And for us, what that looks like is that we cannot talk about the carbon footprint of the materials and we detach it from the human handprint. So I'm going to talk about those two things in conjunction because they go hand in hand. Architecture is not about materials. Materials exist because labor exists that can transform the materials into the buildings we talk about. So we cannot ignore the handprint. And that's a very important point and distinction to make at this point in this presentation. So for us to be able to achieve this, we need to fundamentally change how we approach projects. And what we've done in our practice is to set a very specific goal for the project that, of course, has the specific metrics. You can name anything you want, achieving what the client wants, meet the budget, meet the timeline. I think those basic metrics, everybody knows them. But through the method in which we deliver these projects, we also have to set certain specific metrics that we need to track. How much economic output we're able to produce, how much environmental benefit we're producing, what are we learning, or what everybody around the ecosystem of the project is learning, and then what type of space are we creating, what type of support to growing us as a community are we doing? So that's the part of the emotional that we need to question and make sure we understand what we're doing about it. So the first project I'm going to talk about is Ilima Primary School. This is designed and built in one of the remotest area in Africa. It's in DRC. It's in the middle of nowhere. It takes 5 days to get there from Kigali. You use all methods of transportation that exist on the planet. And the last stretch, that last 4 hours, is on the back of a motorbike. And it's 4 to 5 hours on a path as wide as your shoulders. So the natural constraints of the project itself mandates that we take these things seriously and we think about the materiality, where it comes from, how we choose it, and how it's integrated into that ecosystem. So easier said than done. But luckily, what I was talking about, the handprint earlier, is that the labor force that existed there and the knowledge that they brought from their own understanding of the environment was extremely invaluable, understanding how this is the gold mine that we could utilize to create almost all the materials needed to build this project. So 98% of the materials that built this project came from within 160 kilometers of the project site, at the exception of things like nails that we have to, barge in from Kinshasa. And the result of that is that on the embodied carbon aspect of the project, we scored really, really well on that project. Not because we aimed to do that, but because the conditions forced us to do that. Now, that is an extreme example. And if you look at other things like, we have this thumb of rules in construction industry where we say like labor is about a third of the material costs or whatever that is. But here, like the rules are like very different, because you can see like we spent 83% of the project budget in labor and not in materials, because we didn't purchase in materials. Therefore, the labor became the kind of like the most value that is created through this project and can be translated easily into economic empowerment of this community. So that's how much like the project was spent within the site. And coming out of that project, we basically like established kind of like a rule to assess how these processes should be checked to make sure that they are meeting at least the basic targets we think are on the track to allow us to achieve these things. They are not, we are very familiar with them through like the slow food movement and the slow fashion movement. So good. Is it a good design? Is it a project that is needed? Is it going to provide healthy spaces for what purpose they are meant to serve? Is it clean, obviously, for the environment? Where are we getting the materials from? What pollution are we causing to the planet? Is it justified, even the little carbon emissions the project is going to create? Because it's not realistic to say that you're going to create a project that does not create any emissions at all. But the emissions we create, are they justifiably with the need? And then the last one is very also important. Is it fair? Are we creating value on the supply chain that is meaningful to the people that these projects are meant to serve or that live nearby them, that are made part of this community? I always have discussions where I fight with people who still try to convince me that container solutions is the future to achieving infrastructure needs. But again, that's also like another conference at a later date. So the footprint married with this handprint kind of like quests do actually achieve these things, these goals that are set by our community, whether we set out to do that or not. So like we don't have to worry about those other statistics. When we do things properly, when we go through the entire process of marrying footprints of the buildings to the handprint, we do actually achieve these targets. This is Butaro Hospital, a project we did in 2008. That's when we began, completed in 2012. And when we did an audit of embodied carbon that it produced, it is actually half of the global average for a project of its size and complexity, which means 10 years ago, we were achieving the goals we've set for 10 years later from this point in time. And at that time, there was no COP25, we didn't set out to achieve this low carbon embodied emission. We just wanted to make sure that the process is as empowering as possible and is as utilizing the local materials as much as it can. Now, having learned that, we went and took a tally of all our projects to try to understand where we stand so that if there's something that needs to be corrected, we can correct it. Luckily, we find that average of our projects are below half of the global average, or close to half of the global average. And of course, internally this year, starting last year and this year, we are committed to try to bring this average as lower as we can, actually, to try to figure out how we can perfect the system and try to make it much more lower than we've observed. So that is well and good, but then there's this other goal that we now need to reach net zero by 2050. And I don't want to generalize and say that if we do all of those things on individual projects to have everything, then we're going to reach this goal. I think reaching net zero requires us to do much more than that. And some of it is in our hands as architects and designers, some of it is not. So this project is that I'm going to talk about tries to figure out interventions of things we need to do to reach that goal. So conserving intact landscapes, like how can we minimize the damages we do and contain whatever we're building or whatever we're doing to what is already damaged. Even where we do interventions, how do we restore ecological functions? How do we not create spaces that only good for humans, but forgets everything else that is supposed to exist in a healthy ecosystem? How do you create food that feeds us as a human species, but do it so responsibly without destroying any further habitat? And then the last one, which is also like part of a big topic of what we're talking about here today, how are these buildings put together from these health ecosystems? Reframing the question, this is Rwanda about 27 years ago, showing the natural forests we have. And on the right, you see the white space, that's farmland. We've destroyed like more than 60% of our natural environment in seeking farmland. And in 20 years from now, the population of Rwanda is planned to double, which means we're going to need the land area, twice the country's size to feed the population. And the country is not growing its borders in size. So how do you think about reimagining the agriculture practices in a way that is sustainable is not sustainable, but is able to feed this population, but also maintains a healthy ecosystem? That's what this project is about. How do we move from monoculture to a One Health approach, growing food and creating this ecosystem? This One Health design theory, if people are not very familiar with it, it's very prevalent in veterinary sciences, but it hasn't really embraced in a construction industry and architecture and design. But it's based on this theory that human ecological and animal health are inextricably intertwined, and we need to think about maintaining that balance in everything we do. So that's what the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture is as a project. It's a ground up university that aims to figure out how, in the context of Rwanda and the basin that has the same ecological condition, this could be done in a way that can sustain the populations, but also be able to feed us and contribute to the economic development of these nations. Talking about
Oops.
Yeah. Did I miss did I get disconnected? Yeah, so talking about operational carbon, this campus is 100% off-grid. Therefore, that takes care of halving the operational carbon. The entire water cycle is managed from the site and cleaned through wetlands, through a couple of interventions, and then you go back into like the water bodies. So that's taken care of. I think the technology that exists is easy to do that. Now, talking about now embodied carbon. And this is what I was talking about. We cannot do things as business as usual as we've been conditioned to think. A project of this budget and of this caliber normally would result to the most safest construction systems that we've experimented before, because no one wants to take the risk on millions and millions of US dollars. So we have fought really hard to simplify construction elements and make sure that we bring this bar of the embodied carbon to at the lowest as we can. So there needs to be like a fundamental shift to try to reduce this as much as we can. I can talk about the comparisons later and talk about some of the things that we've removed to make sure that we don't have that excess unnecessary elements that we have all become conditioned to think that we need them, but are not really necessary to create these systems. So, these are very simple systems of like reimagining or going back to how we're building thousands of years, but think about how we do that in a more contemporary, if you want to say, design and intervention and economic development that we all aspire to. Again, back to the labor, who builds these buildings? So about 98% of the labor that contributed to make this project possible came, again, within a radius of 160 kilometers from the site where we're building. These are the people who are making like the fired clay bricks and glazed clay tiles that are normally would be thought, because they're in wet areas, they need to come, we need to use like ceramic tiles from China or from Turkey or whatever it is. But how do we create supply system from zero to make sure that they're all supplied from the region? We're using rammed earth. We are exploring how to utilize craft and materials that exist in other industries, such as simple craft and kitchen utensils of day-to-day lives, but bring them into this like thriving industry and create like an avenue for a new economic impact and products. How do we create elegance? How do we understand modernity? How do we again, back to that question of like, is it good design? How do we make sure like all these things are also not meant that they're cheap or they're not elegant because, we're talking about locally sourced and locally fabricated. And this is the hardest one. I'm sure most people here understand the EPDs. Sorry, I'm over time, but I'm going to wrap up like very shortly. We actually work in a world where we don't have EPDs. So we have to create one. And this is create like a whole other layer of work where we have to go and measure and make sure like we create our own EPDs so we can actually quantify this, what these figures are. And that basically is projecting that the RICA is going to be about 2/5 of the global average for embodied carbon, because we used very simple things, stone masonry, foundations, earth walls, vegetable fibers for furniture and fixtures and all these sort of things. And we're actually projecting that we're going to be carbon positive in 6 years. This is my last slide. I'm happy to expand on these projects later.
Thank you so much, Christian. That was, well, for starters, deeply fascinating and beautifully presented, but also, just gives you so many things to think about, developing the building from the system and from the specifications, the targets that you're setting environmentally, rather than starting with the form and trying to figure out how to build it. It's a totally inverted and much more positive way of thinking about architecture. So a lot to think about there that we'll get back to in our question and answer. Thank you so much for that talk. Let's now turn to Anna Heringer. Anna, please join us.
So can you see my presentation?
Yes, if you could go to full screen, perhaps.
Oh, good point.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you, Christian, for the really wonderful and heartwarming presentation. It completely resonates also with my philosophy, which is architecture is a tool to improve lives. And this picture was taken on an excursion on a study trip with my ETH students. It was the end of October in the mountains in Austria. It was really cold. And I surprised them with the fact that I haven't booked any hut, hostel, hotel, whatever. And that the challenge was, since they're all going to be architects, to build a hut for the night or a shelter for the night. The response was quite mixed, or the reactions, you know, some were thinking, yeah, cool, we are anyway Swiss guys, you know, outdoor freaks, and the others were like, there must be a plan B, but there wasn't. And then the third party was kind of utterly shocked, but we all survived. It was quite tough. It was really cold, but it was a great learning experience that there are, in fact, a lot of resources given by nature for free. And all we need is our sensitivity to see those resources and our creativity to use them. And that were kind of the results, not very luxury. But yeah, it was really a great learning experience. And I found myself in a similar situation when I was an architecture student about 17 years ago. I went to a remote Bangladeshi village called Rudupur with the aim to build a school as my master thesis. And I had lived in that village before when I was 19 years old and a development learner, a volunteer at the Bangladeshi NGO Deepshika. And what I learned from them during that first year was that the most effective strategy for really sustainable development is to really look at the place, check what resources are available, cherish them, value them, and then try to make the best out of it. And this was what I tried to transform in or transfer into architecture then later on. And in terms of materials, I didn't have to look far for the school. They were right under my feet, the mud and the bamboo that was growing all around. And in terms of energy, it was, of course, as you also mentioned, Christian, human energy, labor. When we think of alternatives energies, we always think of solar, wind, and so on. But I think the human energy is a very important resource. On top of it, it's very creative. And if we don't use it, we also create a social problem. So for me, it's always like looking at local materials, looking at local energy sources, and then the global know-how, because I believe that know-how should not be limited to a place, but it should be then adopted to the existing site conditions. Yeah, tools were an issue too, but we had these guys, the water buffaloes. Oh, I think this is not running well. Okay. This was our mixing machines. We had tried it also with cows, but interestingly, the cows were too intelligent. They were always stepping in the holes of the previous round. Not starting any gender discussions here, but it was interesting to see. And yeah, the people came, the workers came all from the village, from Rutupur and the neighboring villages. A great team that is still working with me. And I also had a couple, this was my cousin from Emmanuel and his wife Stephanie, and then I also had an architect from Berlin with me, Eike Roswak, who was my partner for realization. And after 6 months of construction, the school looked like that. So it was a kind of a load-bearing earth walls, like only earth and straw mixed, and then a large bamboo first store. That kind of brings the lightness in. And it's also kind of a power pose for education, which I think is also a nice symbol. Yeah, that's the classroom on the ground floor. And through these holes there, you come to the caves. I thought very simple and archaic. You know, when I'm doing designs, I always think on the most archaic, basic, most archaic human needs, basically. And, you know, when I try to, you know, I always do this exercise with all the students, you know, what were the places that you loved when you were a kid. And it's mostly this kind of situations where you feel very protected, but you have the full overview of what's going on. So the kids actually can go in the caves and have full acoustically and visually still linked with what's going on in the classroom, but they are kind of in this protective area in the back wall of the classroom. And that's the top floor. And the kids also signed with the names in Bengali at the doors, and they not only signed, but they also helped building the school. So it was really my very dream from the beginning. And we brought especially 2 Montessori teachers with us in the team as well, who helped really including the children in the building process. And I think, you know, every person wants to be needed, no matter how weak or small you are, you want to be taken serious and do something meaningful. And it was wonderful to see that the kids, they were almost every afternoon on the site and doing, of course, easy work, but real work. And of course, with the choice of materials, you also define how inclusive a building process can be. And of course, with mud, it's wonderful. I think everyone had the hands in clay and mud before as a child, and it's just a really wonderful feeling. And yeah, in the end, when you stand as a little boy or girl in front of the school, or as a day laborer who had never had the chance to go to school, and then you did this all just by using your hand and the dirt underneath your feet, that just gives such an enormous boost to your own self-confidence and the trust, of course, in the community, in the team, and also in the own resources, the building materials, which have a very bad image. When I came first to Bangladesh, I thought, coming from Germany, I have to bring in the perfect technology, but I figured out it's not what's needed. What is needed is to build up the trust that all what you have is all that you actually need to make something good and beautiful out of it. So that's the school, how it's looking now. It was built in 2005, and that's how it looks now. And the nice thing, there is no cement in the walls, it's absolutely just in the foundation. So that's what I really love on these materials, that you can take them from the ground, can recycle it as often as you want without any loss of quality, and you can give it back to the ground. You can return without leaving any scars, and you can even plant a garden on top of it. And that makes it so wonderful in terms of ecological sustainability. In terms of economics, it was interesting because I lived in the same village, of course, and in the evening I would go with the workers by bike to the local market, and I could see immediately how they spent the money that they received every day for their work. And I could see that they spend it in buying vegetables from the neighbors and the neighboring farmers, or they got a new haircut or a new sari blouse. So the building budget was directly invested in the local markets. And if I had built the school with steel and concrete, this money would have lost for this community. And that made me most happy that this was much more than just a building, but a real catalyst for local development. Yeah, I'm becoming more and more also political because I think, we as architects, we think we have, we are sometimes not aware how political our work is, but we have huge budgets in our hand. If we sum up in the end how much budgets we have, and if we invest it in the right way, and that's, the choice of the building material is very essential in that who ultimately can profit of this building. I think, this is something that we really need to consider much more, and of course, how much impact it has on the environment. This board I also showed to the CEO of Holcim Lafarge. That was kind of an interesting experience. Yeah, 3 billion people approximately are living in mud houses. We always think, it's a small niche, but it's just not on our radar. Of course, the numbers are getting down, and that's dramatic because we need this material. And it's also really problematic that it's hardly taught at any universities. It's not considered worthy of being taught at universities. So I was very happy that I could bring it to the GSD, to Harvard, a couple of years ago when I was a Loeb Fellow there. And we just started to extend the Gund Hall, which is a concrete structure, into the mud hall. And it was really wonderful. We had in the end 150 people participating, students, faculty, but also people from Cambridge just coming in. And it was a really wonderful atmosphere. I mean, it was also emotional. The moment, 60 tons of dirt right in front of the main facade of the GSD was kind of causing emotions as well. And there was every half a day, there was a building stop because of liability issues and so on. But in the end, it turned this place really in a warm place for people together. You would see students and faculty members, of course, but also kids and skaters, of course, and even homeless people staying there overnight. So it was really a wonderful mix of community in the end. And interestingly, people constantly touched the walls. The wall looked like concrete, but people were constantly on the walls. And I could see, we are not perceiving materials just in a visual way, but there's something more that touches these things. And I think there's a very strong connection with people and with earth, you know, it's much more than just a building material, it's an element. And that was just really nice to see. And I think it would just be so good to have more natural materials also in our cities in a very dense context, because it would just make us feel also more warm and more connected to nature. And not only education is important, but also, of course, technological development, which is difficult with, you know, building with natural materials, because you always think, you know, you have to make them better. But in fact, natural building materials such as earth, they have fantastic qualities already. You know, you don't, anything you add, you just make it worse. And why would you add something, you know, when it just has the best property that it can go back to the ground without any harm? But technology, of course, is important, because you cannot let the water buffaloes turn in New York City, you know, if you want to build something. So you have to have kind of a prefabrication method, for example, like Martin Rauch, my colleague in Austria, he has developed that, for example, is the Ricola Herb Center in Switzerland. But still there's a lot of manual labor involved, which makes the material expensive in our parts of the world. And my hope is that we would get a carbon tax soon, you know, and decrease the taxes on human labor instead, so that, you know, it's affordable again to build with these materials. And thirdly, we also need really good build projects, architectural projects that show that you can build with old materials also in a modern way. You know, it's sometimes I'm being asked, do you want to send people back to Stone Age? Of course not, but who says that we cannot build with an old material in a contemporary way? And that's what I want to prove with my work. And, you know, it's not a matter how old a material is, it's a matter of our creative ability to use it for today. These were 3 hostels I built in China, in rural China, in Baoxi. And the core is rammed earth, and then is this bamboo structure around. So the aim of this bamboo biennale was to show the beauty of bamboo. Yeah, so the core is rammed earth and stones, and I think when, you know, that's what you usually see when you go around in the cities in China. It's like when I see this picture, it really makes me really ache in my heart, because it's like all these people have been living in buildings made out of natural building materials between 2011 and 2013. You know, China has consumed more cement than the United States in the past century. So, and this trend is not just China, it's all over the world happening, and we need good alternatives for this. And they are there, they're just, you know, all around, we just have to use them. So this is a project I did with Martin Rauch in Austria that, you know, there's many ways how to use these local materials, and that was, for example, for a high-tech company. And the earth has also the ability to have, you know, to balance the humidity. So it's interesting. You have a very low-tech material, but it has a high-tech performance as well. And then, of course, this notion of participation, you know, that I learned from working in Bangladesh, for example, I also wanted to bring in, you know, when we design here, we usually design the project, but not the process. But I think the process is just as important as the outcome. And we did, that was a proposal for a new altar in front of Balthasar Neumann in a cathedral in Worms, in a very historic place of Germany. And we proposed to bring in the material rather than the artifact, and the community kind of builds the altar themselves. And that, sorry, it's just, the video is not running. So we turned kind of this sanctuary in a construction site for 1 week. And it was quite hard, you know, it was not just leaving a kind of an imprint and a signature there, but it was real work. And I think that's something in our part of the society, we need to learn again, you know, to have an effort to achieve a common goal. And I think this is, in the past, we've been building cathedrals, churches, temples, you know, schools, whatever, and that brought us as a society together. And now we just, you know, are disconnected from this process. And I think that's something that is really missing and also in the more industrialized countries. And that was the result in the end. And it was just, Yeah, it was for me also very symbolic. Like Germany is not lacking of materials, it's not lacking of drama and big designs, but we are lacking on good relationships and meaning, and that's kind of the symbol of this altar. And another project that I'm doing is the Center for Sustainability for the Catholic churches. Again, it's a rent earth structure and then a timber structure boarding hostel. And it's really, comparison building in Bangladesh and building in Germany is really interesting. It's always the most sustainable solution is the most expensive one in with all the rules and regulations that we have. And I think we really have to readjust our economic system, that it is possible to build in the most common sense and with the materials that we have all around. Yeah, and that's my own home. So I'm living in an old 400-year-old house, but I'm having my 6 tons of mud as well inside, and I'm trying to also really live what I'm preaching. But at the same time, I think it's also important to not just to build new again all the time, but also use the existing infrastructure that we have, and then because it's not. Sometimes as Christian said, it's better, not to build because we are harming with what we are doing. So we really have to reconsider every step that we are doing. And for me, this is something I always have in my mind. Whenever I'm designing, I'm trying to multiply all the decisions, all the choices, all the approach by 7 billion times. And consider, how would the world look like? Would I contribute to justice? Would I contribute to climate change? And, how would resources be distributed? Who would get the profit? And I think that's, for me, very helpful, because the world is not changing with one big decision. It's changing with the everyday small decisions that we are taking. And most of the time, it's very much connected also to the choice of the building materials or the materials that we are using and consuming. Yeah, all around us, we have fantastic natural building materials. Let's just use them. And I'm really deeply convinced our homes, our cities, our workplaces would just become not just more healthy and sustainable, but also more humane and beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was such a wonderful presentation. And in particular, I love the way that you showed how these very simple materials of earth or bamboo could become the center of this whole philosophical, technical, aesthetic enterprise. So once you take on that one challenge, how does one dwell in earth, for example, or build with mud? It shows you how much complexity can arise out of that initial decision. Obviously, again, staying very close to the idea of ecological, what Christian called an earth positive or climate positive approach. So really great intersection between those two talks already. And I can tell we'll have a lot to talk about in the Q&A. But first, and certainly not last, let's have Sarah, last but certainly not least, let's have Sarah Whiting from the Harvard GSD join us. Sarah, welcome. And thanks.
Let me just move this over.
Yep.
Okay, and we get to, sorry, I have to see my screen itself. There we go. Are you seeing the full screen or?
Yep, thank you.
Are you seeing all the slides or are you seeing just the one slide?
Just the one slide.
Excellent, okay, super. So first I want to thank Arna for inviting me, Berta for ensuring that everything runs smoothly. And I want to note, Glenn, that you've been an expert host and MC for this whole summit. Thank you, Christian and Anna, for your great talks. Frankly, I don't need to be here because there's plenty to talk about with both of them. And Anna, I wish that installation were still in front of Gund. I have no idea why they removed it. I also want to say that I thoroughly enjoyed the presentations yesterday by the 4 fellows. I think it's incredible to see the work that they were able to do and to see this taking off. So hats off. I think it's really fantastic.
Thank you.
So I'm going to use my few minutes, and this is my favorite Myra Coleman cartoon because I think we all wish we had more time. But I'm going to use my few minutes to ensure that we talk about the topic of politics. So our session is entitled Material Ecologies in Architecture and Communities. So I want to focus less on craft and materials. I think my two other panelists did that, and more on architecture's audience or community, to use the term from this title, the title of this panel. So to set the stage, let me echo Alice Rawthorne's important closing comments from her terrific talk yesterday, where she noted that those entering design culture today actually have the good fortune of a context that is opportune in terms of social, political, and economic awareness. I so appreciate Alice's optimism because, let's face it, 2020 may well be one of the most difficult years that we've experienced worldwide, but her talk kept all of us pointing forward with its focus on the number of designs that are also laying the groundwork for a sustainable future. So, I think that's important to keep in mind. So forgive me, because I'm going to take a detour that's laden with a little bit of pessimism before I too, and I hope on an optimistic tone. For I think it's important, critical even, to acknowledge that architecture is hard. While I think we can extrapolate many of these points to design writ large, I'm going to focus on architecture per se. So first off, does architecture even have an audience? So if Walter Benjamin could write in 1937 that architecture is experienced in a state of distraction, just imagine what he would have said today with cell phones. So what's the impact of today's tempo of ephemerality upon architecture and design? Some issues, first the Time's Up and Me Too movement, and now the Black Lives Matter movement, have introduced another cadence of time into our contemporary mix, urgency. So the mix of urgency and ephemerality is a huge challenge, and one that's faced by all of culture today, not just architecture and design. How do we get urgent issues to stick in a world that resists stickiness in favor of the next and the new? It's a question, I would argue, of communication and of legibility. As a little bit of an aside, it was students at Harvard's Graduate School of Design who designed and silkscreened the Red Fist during the strikes that happened at the university in 1969. Harry Cobb, who then headed the school's alumni board, during those years, confessed to me that while the strikes marked that era, they coincided with a period of particularly weak teaching in the school. And I think that imbalance at the GSD in 1969, strong student activism, but weak teaching of design, speaks to a continued challenge. I'm not confident that we truly understand what it means to learn or to practice within this now expanded lens of our constituencies. In short, what it means to be political as architects and as designers. So it can, in fact, be easier to be a political activist than a design activist, which can be, because design can be very slow and very compromised. So to elaborate on these challenges of slowness and compromise, architectural practice differs from most artistic practices in its scales, complexities, economies, and liabilities. It demands extreme generalism and at the same time, extreme expertise across a spectrum that ranges from A to Z, aesthetics to zoning. And Christian's presentation, I think, illustrated this range beautifully with a discussion. You speak with as much ease about reimagining agricultural practices and health policies as you do about local materials and the expertise about local materials and building expertise. So architecture has a temporality that demands patience. It's not the first responder of the arts world. Architecture requires collaborations that go beyond peers or even beyond those who share any affinities. Many of architecture's collaborations are obligatory rather than voluntary, and they're highly imbalanced relations. These are the relations with contractors, with regulators, with community boards, banks, and clients. All those who determine the rules and budgets by which and in which we operate. So I don't giving away more. I don't foreground architecture's complicated or imbricated status either as a criticism or as an excuse. I think it's simply a given. So it's a given that makes architectural practice already political, but it's also what makes it hard for any architect to act politically. That is, practice is always political, It's a perpetual agonist in an enterprise, but it's one where architects are almost always losing the playing field to dominant hegemonies, that is, those with the power and those with the purse. And it's also why it's so hard to find allies within our playing field. And that's why so many architects respond either by producing the expected status quo, and this is the home of someone who is a fabulous art collector and record producer, music producer, and yet you see what architecture he commissions. Or architects retreat to cardboard architecture, drawing or writing, and I'll note here just for the record that cardboard architecture has a huge place in our discipline. By suspending constraints on architectural execution, we can explore and forge new possibilities, but right now I'm talking about practice itself. Another response to the constraints on architectural practice is to reduce practice to artistic installations where the parameters can be controlled, or some architects respond with technical expertise, digital or material, that enables them to dominate some exchanges by gaining hold of the reins of capital that control our field. So it's also why practice is such an absent topic from architectural education. Practice within a school of architecture can be idealized because the agonistic players can be very controlled. And while I defend that idealized model, because it's so easy for the real world practice to overwhelm even within a school, I find the lack of pedagogy that pushes practice's boundaries a remarkable missed opportunity. So in an effort to draw out some of the contours of a possible agonistic practice, I'd posit that design has to be projective. That is, it has to have a project. Arne was talking about this in the final conversation yesterday in his desire for work to have, and forgive my German accent or lack thereof, a Gestaltung mit Haltung, a design with attitude. Second, I'd argue that to have an impact, that project, that Gestaltung mit Haltung, has to be legible. So in demarcating any space with its built forms, and this is a failed development in the southwest of the US, but you can still see the lines of demarcation. Architecture necessarily creates definitions that include and that exclude. It's because of exclusions engendered by this demarcation that antagonisms can occur. So the public design charrette, which has become a default means of gaining public buy-in for any project, offers a false promise of consensus for architecture, with the belief that colored pencils, magic markers, Post-it notes, and red and green dots can offer a common language for the public to reach consensus on design. It literally papers over antagonisms, which is where politics really lie. Consequently, that consensus manifests itself either in remarkable banality, as we find in a number of public buildings like these two examples of contemporary US post offices, which as an aside totally depresses me because I do work on I write about public buildings and the history of public buildings. Here are two, a post office from 1907 in Niagara Falls and another one from 1941 in Anchorage, Alaska. So it's quite sad to see that disappearance, let's say, of good public architecture. But so this banality is one answer. Consensus can also lead to a buffet of options, such as in Topotech and Big's Superkiln project in Copenhagen that attempted to represent everyone equally. In pointing out the pluralizing quality underlying all language, French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard reminds us that such aspirations to community consensus are utterly impossible. As we all know, misunderstandings can arise when two speakers use the same words, but with different senses or different references. This is what Lyotard calls the différent, or that quality of language that can never fully be defined. Now, I love the différent, partly because I love the structure and precision of language. I'm a language geek. And how that precision is nevertheless always paired with an equally beautiful indeterminacy of interpretation. So we can turn to Alexis de Tocqueville for another analogy that might be closer to home. In writing Democracy in America, he warned of Americans' love for generalizations. An abstract word like democracy, de Tocqueville wrote, is like a box with a false bottom. You put in it any ideas you please, and you take them away without their being missed. And I'll note that that's a particularly poignant quote these days in the US. So I would argue it's with this combination of demarcation and indeterminacy that architecture's politics lie. Architecture's demarcations, its walls, its property boundaries, its other limits define, but nevertheless always carry a multitude of meanings. They're the built equivalent of Lyotard's différents or de Tocqueville's boxes with false bottoms. So the question becomes, how can precise, demarcated indeterminacy be exploited to advantage so as to give architects more of a role on the playing field? And I'll end with briefly just talking about one of our projects in our office, WW Architecture. This is a project called Kaiway Exchange. It's a project that's housing resources for environmental, agricultural, tourism, and business interests. Now, Kaiway is a small agrarian town of about 20,000 people outside Changsha, which is a metropolis of 7 million people. Then the aim of this project is to exploit urban and rural ties of benefit to the local agricultural economy while preserving Kaiway's beautiful and productive landscape of tea and flower plantations. So this client came to us wanting a building for uses that were as yet unknown to her. So our response was to develop a pre-programmatic approach to the design of spaces that is a means of catalyzing possible uses without predetermining what exactly might happen within them. We began with the most elemental of plan types, so the perfect square, a nod to modernism's universal space. And then there's the perfect square. Then we introduced a set of notches, notched terraces and courtyards that bring in light to the depth of the square while also modulating the floor plates, creating an entire array of rooms of varying sizes and proportions. The generalization of pre-programmatic space only works through the incredible specificity of defining the sizes of spaces, the dimensions of radii, and other demarcations. The result is a collection of spaces and relationships that suggest a range of future scenarios. We envisioned 100 variations, not as neutral spaces, but as partial rooms and implied organizations. Oops, that was supposed to be an animation, but it won't. Looks like it's not going to go. So to return to the topic at hand, the topic of time, let me see if that, let me try and make that run again. Yeah, you're not seeing the animation, right? Oh, you are, okay. So architecture has a temporality that demands patience. It's a practice that's imbricated, complicated, and often imbalanced. But while we can't freeze time by idealizing uses, populations, or contestations, we can shape spaces that create political possibilities by offering up spaces that help us to shape uses that we can't even predict. In short, we need to be specific so as to unleash the various indeterminacies that constitute architecture's political future. So here's Changsha versus Kaiway. So combined with this specific indeterminacy, the Kaiway Exchange project is political also in its regionalism, which is another point that I'd like to put on the table as a means of combating the global-local binary that often comes to the fore when talking about topics like materials, craft, and production, sustainability. So Kaiway is one of many little villages that's located in Changsha County, about an hour's drive from this city. And again, it's a city of 7 million people. It's huge. And Kaiway is about 20,000. Changsha County surprisingly looks like Napa Valley. It's a region of rolling hills filled with verdant terraced tea and flower plantations. So our client sees the project as a means of supporting the local tea and flower farms so that this beautiful part of China doesn't get consumed the way that Changsha itself has. Events held in the Kaiway Exchange would be supported with local workforce and would feature local food and products, thereby creating and fostering a regional rather than a global or local economy of production. And I will end there, and I think I too went over time, I'm sorry.
Well, every minute was well worth it. So thank you, Sarah. That was fantastic. That animation that shows how one building can be an unending series of
100, yeah.
flexible, well, it felt like infinity. So that was an extraordinary materialization of the basic principles that you've been talking about. And I thought you also had so much to say that was relevant to the first two talks. I'm looking forward to the kind of crossing of exchange here. I am actually going to start with a question because I want to encourage more for our audience. So I'm just going to go back to something that Maria Nicanor asked, and she suggested we might ask this first of Anna, who mentioned Lafarge's book, Less Cement, More Earth. And the question is, can you comment on how to engage with industries that oftentimes are at the center of some of the challenges discussed today? How have you brought them, these industries, into your projects respectfully to make it part of the solution? And how do you critically incorporate their politics or those politics into the work? Anna, perhaps you could start with that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there is a right material for every purpose. You know, you need concrete is of course a very precious and valuable material for foundations, for example. There you can't use bamboo or timber or mud. So, but it's the question of overuse. You know, it's not, you know, blaming someone the bad guy. And but of course, I mean, every change hurts. You know, I think I think we need drastically to change our building industries, and of course change is in the beginning always uncomfortable. You know, that's, I think it would be a lie to say that, you know, it will be all going super smooth. I think there will be something, but of course there's also a lot to win, I think, you know, and that's the having a sense, having, you know, and knowing to contribute something good. And of course that sometimes also needs a confrontation. That's I haven't figured it out that, you know, I'm not a total harmony junkie, but it's, of course, when discussions are coming to a point, you know, then I'm of course for reducing the overuse of certain materials, but still, I mean, there is plenty of need of those materials. All I'm saying that, you know, these materials are precious and they should pay a precious price for that. You know, so that it's no, you know, that we really consider also if is it really necessary to use these precious materials for building an entire building. Well, it just would be okay for ring beam and for the foundation, for example. So I think we have to really go in dialogue and see, you know, what makes sense to use what material for what purpose. But I think it doesn't, you know, change is not coming without any feeling of uncomfortableness. I think it's part of reality, but there's a lot of win.
So essentially what you're saying is that, as Sarah said, papering over the conflict and saying, well, surely we can bring these industries with their way of doing business along and it'll be fine for them too somehow. That's really not an option because we actually have to make the choice.
Yeah, but I mean, there's of course a lot to learn from the technologies of you know, like rammed earth. You need all the shuttering systems. You know, there's a lot to learn, of course, from the concrete industry. Of certainly, and sure. And of course, the brick industry, for example, they know they are in much more difficult situation because, you know, they cannot reduce the temperature. They always need the carbon emissions in it because they need to fire it so high. So, but you know, then for them, the step is easier to go into earthen architecture because, you know, it's the same material, just without firing. Mm-hmm. So there are some bridges, but it takes courage to go over these bridges.
Christian, can I bring you? Oh, sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
Sorry, can I piggyback on Maria's question, which I thought was great, and in terms of, because I think one of the issues, of course, for attracting big industry to techniques like rammed earth or working with bamboo is the question of scaling up in terms of production. And so can you speak to that actually? Because that seems like that's a way of actually bringing them on board in a positive manner.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, what of course is important that it goes more in, you know, also it doesn't fit in the regulation systems. Like when I'm working here, you know, then it's the thing with fireproofness. I mean, what happens if earth is fired, it turns into brick, worst case scenario, you know, but you don't have the figures, you know, to put it in. So there's a lot there is a lot of research needed that we can put it into figures and that it's usable also for big industries and to make it easier. And then of course to have like prefabricated elements that enhances a much more speedy implementation of these things. So kind of, yes, regulations are kind of nerve-wracking, but we have to deal with it in our system. So we need a lot of research into these things. And well, the material is everywhere available, and you know, it needs the technologies and the know-how. So it's basically the know-how, education is key. And then the nice thing with, you know, what I've seen in every site, you know, you need some people who know the craft, and that it's, but you can include and involve so many unskilled people in doing this thing. So it's possible to scale it up. And also because already so many people are living in earthen houses, it's not a kind of dream fantasy, it's actually reality, but it needs the education and it needs the technology to scale it up.
Yeah, so that leads me back to what I was going to ask Christian. So Christian, you made this extremely important point that when you reallocate the overall project budget away from other variables into labor, effectively what you're doing is supporting the community around the building, which is a point, Anna, that you made as well about, you know, the income that people derived from their work on the building going right into the market, for example. And Christian, I'm wondering, first of all, whether you've had a kind of pushback of the kind that the questioner, Maria, is implying, that, you know, there are vested interests that actually want architecture to be built on the principles it's been built on. In other words, that money's not going to the communities, but is going to large corporations. And also maybe the opposite, which is how do you get the local community engaged, and how do you ensure success in working with them and make sure that that's a very positive relationship, not an exploitative one or simply an ineffective one, because that's obviously just as complicated as any other operation you can undertake architecturally. So how do you work between the, you know, when you reallocate money into that local labor force, what else happens?
Yeah, thanks. That's a wonderful question, and I think there are many wonderful things that my co-panelists have actually brought up that speaks to the core issue that is creating the situation you're responding to now. And again, if I use the example of cement that, you know, someone asked as our first question, like, cement as a product itself has no problem. It's how it's produced that is the problem, is the challenge. So I think one of the things that we need to realize is that, you know, the architecture profession by nature is going to serve a system that is established. So we, you know, if we're working on operating in a system that is not set up for success, there's, you know, it's very difficult to conceive how the architecture is going to produce good results. So, you know, in simple terms, it doesn't matter how good the solution is if it's the wrong problem. And because of that, then we need to do two main things. Unfortunately, we architects, we are like ill-equipped to deal with them, but we have to because we have no choice. So the first problem, as Anna mentioned, is to influence some of these big corporations that have invested massive investments into the production of these things, which, you know, they created companies that they create jobs. Like, you know, it would be not right to demonize them per se, but we need to push them to do things more the right way. So not to say, you know, sustainably. You know, like one of the things that you know, globally we're going to come to understand and agree is that this obsession with efficiency that creates like maximum profits for like one gigantic company, like, is the source of all these problems. Like, everybody's looking at like at the bottom line of a spreadsheet, and they want that difference to be as big as possible with minimum investment as possible. So I think we need to be activists as architects to try to push the supply chain systems that we rely on to create good architecture to change and support these missions of things we do. Then the other thing we have to do is also to use our innovation capabilities, our creativity, to imagine alternative supply chain system that we can create, especially as Anna said, and Sarah also confirmed, when we control these mass budgets and we have a good say in how they can be dispersed through our ideas, empower like an environment that can allow the creation of alternative supply systems that can either come and rival these big ones that are existing and force them to change, or create new materials and building elements that makes the original ones obsolete, so that we can actually, again, influence them to change or take up this technology and we scale them up. We need to do both of them. Unfortunately, we don't have time, we don't get paid to do it, we don't learn how to do that in school. We for a long period of time, we architects have insulated ourselves, against all these problems. And I think it's time we come out of this shell and, as Anna says, have these uncomfortable conversations, because if we don't, nothing is going to change. So I think that's the two based way I know we need to do this, and we're trying to do as much as we can. Some of us work in environment where there are more opportunities to do that than others, but I feel like regardless whether you're practicing in Germany or you're teaching in the United States or you're building projects in Rwanda, I think collectively as a community we do have to join forces and make sure like this is happening on all levels of architecture, education, and practice.
Yeah. And what about, Christian, that part of working with the local workforce or regional workforce, as Sarah is reminding us to say? Do you have experiences that you would want to share with the audience about how to do that well, how to do it effectively?
Absolutely. I don't know if I know well how to do it very well. I think we're still trying to figure out how to do it. But again, this is what comes out when you make this commitment. When you say this commitment that we're going to create a whole new supply chain that either invents a material, that explores using a material in a different ways than it's been used before. We're going to keep, put up this fight with the building code. So we're going to have problems with, city, municipality inspectors, but we're convinced to do that. We're going to have, obviously, the, challenges with like change of minds, even like for the local community of people we work with, because working with the mass, and that's been working with CMUs for 25 years, since before I was born, to tell them that now we need to use Earth. It's as difficult as telling someone who's like a city inspector that we're going to do these things and it's not allowable in the code, but it can still achieve the same principles. The challenge is that when we go through architecture school, and I'm going to speak for myself here because I don't know how, what other programs people went through, we only taught one type of kind of like language translation, and I think it's a beautiful language translation that allows us to kind of like, take our thoughts and be able to convert them and convey them effectively through ideas, through our designs and architecture, which is beautiful. But there's this also like aspect of, to learn how to translate this brilliance back into like so many different languages. This entire ecosystem requires us to speak and communicate to. And I don't think there's no single architect who's going to be the kind of full like master of all of those things. So we need kind of like to play into, one's strength and weakness and one's connection and abilities to be able to connect to one group versus the other, connect to the big corporation, connect to the local authority. And that's why this system of an architect genius, the single authorship of like this genius architecture is not entirely true. Like, because like for you to realize that great architecture, there's so many help and aid you need to get through all this community that will help translate that genius to so many different audiences, similar to what Sarah was talking about, that, like every architectural project itself is going to become, if it's properly done, well done, is going to become like a community project. And the quest to create this kind of like single authorship, star architect things, what is again forcing us to the opposite side of this pendulum, where you want only your ideas to be translated through like factories that can, understand your language through one single phone call, or through space, like a single specification of a window casing in the catalog, which is what I think we should go away from, unless the supply system is set up in a way that allows for that. But so far, it's clearly not. So I don't know if there's a one best way of doing it, but I think the only way it's been effective is when we learn how to communicate these things in different and simple terms that are relevant to who we are communicating them to.
Yeah.
Because if they don't take them up, if they don't understand them, then we failed. Today, I read somewhere, and I don't know if this is a quote of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but somebody basically wrote it as her quote, so I can't vouch for that. But it's a beautiful quote. It says basically that we have to fight for things that we have faith in, but do so in a way that other people join us. And when you think about it and do it that way, and then you bring everybody on board, like your primary mission is not the architecture itself, is to bring everyone on board who's going to make that architecture possible.
Yeah.
That's
the hard part.
Arno, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, Christian, I wanted to ask you something about that example you gave with the larger community of like sort of plant research and animal cultivation, et cetera. And I was wondering what experiences you have made in the sort of syntropic farming approach, and transposing that to material development. I mean, you were mentioning just now that you would also be looking at the development of new materials, or the implementation of traditional materials in new ways. And this is something that we've actually been focusing on during our fellowship program at the Design Academy Zalik over the past week with the fellows, and I would be very keen to learn whether you have any specific experiences in that field.
Not particularly on this project, but there's a project we're doing with Farm Hub in New York City Valley that I think my colleagues could speak to more than I can, where we're trying to figure out what would it take to literally grow your buildings. And what we're trying to think about in that project is like, if we're saying we're going to need, I don't know, X amount of insulation, and we know, we're building on a farm that could have sheep on the farm, and like sheep wool does make good insulation. Like, how many sheep would we need to have if, transpose them on our timeline of construction, and, how much wool does one sheep produce? And by the time we need that insulation, how can we make sure that the sheep that is on the farm has actually produced enough wool that allows us to have that insulation? So we also we're lucky we're working with like a partner, a client who's willing to entertain us, going through that thought process. In the context of Rwanda, in that project particular that I spoke about, one of the things that we're trying to understand, one is the timber supply system, which is very much in its infancy. Try to understand what are the native species, where do they come from, how do they go from, basically being, felled in the forests or in whatever they're getting them from, to when they get on a construction site and the treatment they have to go through. What's toxic, what's not toxic. And then we go to things like all clay-based materials. How does, let's say, the fuel for firing, like firewood, firing with firewood in Rwanda is illegal already, which is a good thing. But what other proceeds of agricultural processes that can allow us to get affordable fuel that is part of that agricultural proceeds to make sure like the clay products are also produced in a way that is sustainable. So, for instance, all our clay bricks and clay tiles for that project are done in a factory that is using coffee husks to fire their products. So one of the things we're looking at this, and this has been a challenge for us as we work on larger and larger scales of project, is to not only look at the kind of like ecosystem of that particular project, but look at like the entire country and the entire region, how that is produced, so that we can, you know, make a case for why things should be done that way, both policy-wise, but also like in practicalities. And the reason why we've opted to focus our efforts into that is because we are also working in the region of the world that is obsessed with development. Like there's this kind of like feeling like we need to catch up with the developed world. And the more we jump on that train quicker and you know, irresponsibly, the more we be headed in the wrong time. Yeah. So I'm more than happy to, when you have time, to speak to the specifics about a project and how you can create that and do it, all these sort of things. But I just didn't have the slides today that I can point to. I don't know if that answers your question. I said so many things.
Certainly, thank you.
Yeah. Let me just convey a couple of other questions that we've gotten from the audience. First, from our own Tatjana Sprick. Maybe I could pose this to Sarah initially, because it's a sort of larger scale question, and your talk was a bit larger scale. So she asks, why are buildings like the Snøhetta project in Brattørkaia, and of course that's the ultra eco-friendly project in Trondheim in Norway, which perhaps you know, but why are buildings like that so rare? So really high eco, high success buildings. Is this because the developers are resistant to innovation or not enough architects are familiar with the new technologies? So where's the gap?
I think Christian already answered it. It's the bottom line problem and the anxiety. So developers are anxious to do something that it doesn't have a track record. And partly they actually are beholden to banks who are resistant to offering lending, you know, mortgages and lending money for developers. So it's not just the developers. I think it's also the bank system prioritizes tried and true models. And so it's money more than anything else, which is why, you know, clients who can serve as sort of patrons are so valuable to us. And I would turn that to a question I had actually also for Christian, if I can butt in again, and that is sort of to go back to Maria's question about the, you know, how can you interfere or get these corporations to make changes? I mean, you've pushed at the Ministry of Health, right, to get changes for a hospital that is unconventional, right, in terms of how most ministries would approach a hospital design. And so I wonder if you have any examples of your political work where you've, in a way, maybe not corporations, you haven't approached Lafarge Holcim, but you've approached entities, your clients are complicated political entities, and so it's not that dissimilar. And how have you convinced them to give you the time and allow you to do these kind of projects or this kind of approach?
Yeah, it involves a lot of actual lying. That, you know, by lying I mean is talking to them about things they care about. Exactly. So it's true. Is like many of the people you'll be talking, those you know, institutions of power will have priorities. They want to get things done within a certain budget, and they want to do it done within a certain timeline before the next election, so they can claim credit for it. So I guess, like, you know, you need to say, you know, give them confidence. Like, sure, we can do it within that budget, and we can do it within that time, and you know, make them feel like whatever they're worried about in that particular project is going to be taken care of. It's going to be world class. It's going to get done within a budget they're comfortable with, and it's going to be done within the time they want it to be done. And then, you know, go figure out frantically in the back to try to see how you make it like as good as possible. Because one of the things I was saying earlier about this translation is very important. One of the things I think we architects have failed to do for a long time is to speak non-architectural language. Like we've spoken to other architects, we've we've mastered how to communicate the brilliance within projects, and we pat each other on the back, we give each other awards, and we feel good about ourselves. But you find that most of the time now, like people who are the decision making in our society have excluded the architects. Now it's the developers and politicians who are making all these decisions because of this private club we have created. So one of the things that we also have, I think, to do or go back to is this architect politician, where we now like, yes, we keep all that brilliance, all that conversation within our private group, but then make sure like we also learn how to communicate back to these power structures around us and be able to make sure like these things that we are advocating for, that we are convinced are the right thing to do actually get on the political agenda. Like we cannot shy away from these conversations anymore. It's both a disservice to us and our society.
Mm. So as Sarah said earlier, architecture is hard, and it necessarily includes the political. Let me pose another audience question to Anna.
I just wanted to say something also. It's about what you mentioned, Sarah, the anxiety that is the core problem, and I think that's true. I mean, but we have one powerful weapon, and I think that's the beauty, because it's really, that's touching our emotions. And for me, beauty is a formal expression of love, you know, that can fight the fear. And I think really everyone wants to be, in the end, standing in front of a building that is just really beautiful, and not just from the outside, but also from within, you know, from the process.
I think that's super important as a point, Anna, and I have to really commend, I think your work is very beautiful, and I think that is incredibly important, because I agree, Christian, we want to throw out the starchitect, but we don't want to throw out good design. And I think that often actually happens with the critique of the star system, is a kind of an embarrassment about good design, thinking that that's also irresponsible, and it's not. And so, you know, I do think, you know, as I said, I wish your installation was still in front of the school.
Thanks.
It's interesting to think of the aesthetic as a political tool, and maybe one of the architect's most useful political tools. You know, think of it as visual rhetoric, maybe, which flattens it out, but you can see how effective it is. Okay, so our question from Juliana Carmona, and I guess this probably was for Anna. Besides local natural materials adapted to the 3 projects, do you incorporate non-conventional systems of water, energy, and waste management to reduce ecological impact as well in your projects?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we try to be off-grid, and, you know, we try to have the wastewater, you know, in Bangladesh, they even don't have, you know, the system. So it's sometimes even no choice. And yeah, we're trying to do as much as possible. But I mean, the last project, which is quite difficult, quite curvy and whatever. And I was just amazed how well the workers were able to do it all on their own. You know, we were there, like I was there 2 times, but very briefly only, and Stefano from my team also just 2 weeks. So whatever, you know, at the moment, it's also now that we can't travel, we have to see how far we get with the existing resources and the existing know-how. And the more time is allowed to be on site, again, the more we can push forward and push limits. And of course, with every project that we are doing, we are trying to push the limits a bit further, you know, and incorporate even more and be more deeper. Like in the last Bangladeshi projects, we are even responsible for, you know, the textiles that are produced in this kind of textile factory. So it's you know, taking also responsibility, not just for the vessel, but also for the content. So with every project, there is something new coming up, and it's always exciting and a wonderful learning process.
Okay, well, we're just at the end of our time, unfortunately. I feel we could talk about this for a good long time further, but it's been a fantastic conversation and so enlightening. I wonder, Arna, because this is the end of our formal proceedings over the past 3 days, whether you would have any concluding remark to make.
Well, my concluding remark is very much that I want to thank everyone for the exciting experience we've had. I don't know if everyone in the audience and on the panel had the chance to listen into the first 2 days of our digital summit this year. But we were summing up our fellowship program, which was the inaugural fellowship program at the Design Academy Zalek. And we were very excited. We learned a tremendous amount. We had 4 extremely inspired and inspiring young emerging and talented individuals residing with us from the fields of really design, craft, and architecture, all three areas that we're focusing on. And it was a remarkable experience and a wonderful and exciting vision for what is going to come in the years to follow. Now, I want to thank Berta very much for her technical support over the last 3 days. We had some rockety moments, but you managed very well and very calmly. And thank you ever so much, Glenn. I hope this is not the last time we work together. It has been a pure pleasure, and you've been so insightful and intelligent and just a wonderful moderator for this this program. And I want to thank the panelists of today. I want to thank, in alphabetical order, Christian so much for sharing your insight and the time today. I hope we also stay in touch. I think we have a lot of things that we could talk about, and maybe some potential projects that we can kick off between our initiative in the center of Germany and your work in Rwanda. And I have a special I think it's very important for us to connect between Europe and Africa, and I think maybe we can make a difference in that respect. Anna, I want to thank you tremendously. I'm going to drag you to dieDAS, I'm sure many times in the years to come, because I personally very much think what you do is beautiful and also important, and the collective approach to building and to experiencing the sort of development of architecture, I think is wonderful. Sarah, thank you ever so much for being with us today. And I will also be calling you because I hope that all of you will be our parts of our dieDAS network as we're sort of growing and learning and moving to the future. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. And I look forward to the next steps in our mutual journey.
And I'll just close with a comment from our listener, viewer, Arthur Duncan, who says it's time to get into good trouble. So words to live by there. So thanks everyone for joining in, and we'll hope to see you again.
Thank you very much.